It's a great pleasure to be here, and I thought it might be quite important because I've worked in the international scene for the cooperative movement, to give you some idea of exactly what the cooperative model of enterprise, as it is actually contributing across the world, and how I've tried to influence that over the last few years. So let's see if we can just open these up. Okay. So first of all, a very, very, very potted history. Some of you will know about the cooperative movement. Its genesis is, of course, the northwest of the UK, where it was developed. It grew out of the Industrial Revolution and very much built on the work of the 18th, 19th century philosopher and social campaigner Robert Owen. There were cooperatives before 1844, but most of them didn't last the test of time. But in 1844, a group of mill workers from Rochdale actually they'd started in 1842, meeting weekly, and this is what made the difference and set off this explosion of cooperatives, not just here in the UK, but around the world. 2 years before, this group of mill workers, all men, decided they would start to meet and talk about how they dealt with some of the health problems for their families, the dangers to the poverty they were living in the Industrial Revolution, the way their food was adulterated, and so on and so forth, the powers of the mill workers, of the mill owners. And what they did was they started to meet weekly to discuss not how they could take their family out of what the pragmatic effect would be and what they should start to do, but thinking about the philosophy and the principles and the values that would underpin a model of enterprise that would change life for their people. So it was a very, very long considered approach before they actually published in 1844 what they called the Law First, which set out the values and principles of this new model of enterprise that they were going to introduce. And on the 21st of December 1844, they opened the first cooperative shop in Rochdale, and that has been the genesis of the entire movement across the globe in terms of the codification that the Rochdale pioneers made during those 2 years that they established the underlying principles and values of the movement. And it spread around the world, this cooperative model of enterprise, with enormous speed. Bearing in mind the time, one of my other roles is as a trustee of the National Cooperative Heritage Trust. And I know when we were digitising the absolutely priceless collection of the works of Robert Owen and the Rochdale pioneers that we have, we found a letter from a black miner in what is now South Africa, and it was dated 1849, 5 years after the pioneers established their first shop. And they were asking to please send them information about the Rochdale model of cooperatives, because they wanted to try and use it to take their miners' control of their workplace in Africa. And that was 5 years after the pioneers. And not only that, but we were staggered at this letter, which we found was a real gem of historical evidence about the conditions that existed at the time in Africa, let alone what we were combating here in the UK. So it spread around the world very, very fast. And today, the global statement of cooperative identity is rooted in the values and principles that were established by the Rochdale pioneers. So they weren't the first cooperatives, but they codified what has become the statement of cooperative identity, which is now stewarded for the entire global movement by the International Cooperative Alliance, which is the global body that all cooperatives around the world aspire to be members of and are encouraged to be members of. I put a couple of quotes up there because I think most people won't know the global reference of the cooperative movement. And as you can see from the background paper of the new UN's World Summit on Social Development, which said that cooperatives contribute directly to improving the standard of living of half the world's population. And I can tell you from my own experience that in some parts of the developing world, the real economy in some of those countries, 60% of it will be in the hands of informal and formal cooperatives. So it's a huge impact across the world. And I have the great privilege, as you can see here, of having spent 50 minutes, a 50-minute with 5 of my colleagues, talking to Pope Francis, who told us that he has a campaign, as some of you may know, to put the human being back in the global economy. And he is, in some places, regarded as the co-op Pope. He was actually working very closely with cooperatives in Argentina before he became Pope, and so he followed that through with a very strong commitment to taking forward with high-level groups like the G20 and others the need for human beings to be a critical part of the global economy. So what is it that this statement of cooperative identity? Here you see the principles and values of the cooperative movement. What is it that makes us different? It's these. Now, I'm not saying to you, I'm not naive enough to say to you that every cooperative, and we'll know that from what happened, those of you who followed the news here about the cooperative bank will know that clearly these principles had gone awry. But these are the principles of the movement. These are the principles that all cooperatives aspire to, and the values, as you can see there. What is it that makes us different? Because these demonstrate that constitutionally cooperatives are created to serve the needs of their members, which means they put people at the critical, crucial part of their decision-making, economic decision-making. Of course, they need to make profits or surpluses, as they were called initially, but they don't have to do that to the detriment of their members' needs. And I think that, for me, has been a crucial motivating factor for me wanting to work within this movement. Now, we don't have a global presence as a cooperative movement because cooperatives are inherently local and they work locally. And they're owned and controlled by local people for local people. Most of them remain like that, very local, but some are very big. And one of the things that we did that we're trying to do now is to have a public awareness campaign so people around the world will realise that they themselves can, in this period of volatility still in the global economy, that they can take control of some of the things that they want to remedy in their own communities. They can do it through the vehicle of cooperatives. So we launched a global mark for the cooperative movement. And I could show you very big, large cooperatives that use it, but I wanted to show you this picture. This is a very small village cooperative halfway up a mountain in Bhutan. And it shows you the other bit of the movement. It shows you what cooperative enterprise does for communities. And the co-op that you see written up there is the new mark. And they sent this to us to show that even halfway up a mountain in Bhutan, they're using the global mark that is now used in 100 countries across the world, representing cooperatives. So part of what we've been trying to do over the last few years is bring the cooperative movement and its values into a greater synergy with those who make decisions about the direction of the global movement. And it was my role as president, and by the way, the first woman president, after 120 years of the International Cooperative Alliance, the first woman president, and that despite the fact that cooperatives, women have had full rights in cooperatives since 1844. So 80 years before women had the vote in this country, or whatever, longer than that, women had full rights in the cooperative movement. And the vast majority of cooperatives around the world, women are in the majority at grassroots level, but of course it took 100 years to get a woman at the global level. But what we are now trying to do is this real public campaign so that ordinary folk will recognise that the cooperative movement is something that they can actually use as a vehicle to support communities, to be a sort of bridge between that and the global economy. But what's the size of the cooperative movement today? Owned by 1 billion of the world's citizens, a talking point with Pope Francis because it's second only to the Catholic Church as a membership-based organisation, but owned by 1 million of the world's citizens, provides employment or supports the livelihood of 250,000 people. If you're a farmer or a fisherman in a cooperative, you're not employed by it, but you're getting your livelihoods totally supported by it. Same for worker cooperatives. So the UN, at a conservative estimate, reckons there are 2.5 million cooperatives. That is a conservative figure because many of them work in the informal economy. Many of them are very small. Some countries don't record them. So we don't know the actual number. But what we do know is for the last 5 years we've been recording the value of the combined turnover and other statistics, number of employees, number of members, in the largest 300 cooperatives in the world. We have a database of 3,000 of the largest, and we know that the largest 300 last year had a combined turnover of 2.5 trillion US dollars. That is larger than the GDP of the UK. It makes it equivalent to about the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world. And that figure has grown year on year despite, since 2009, despite what's happened in the global economy. I hope that's given you a sense. The cooperative movement's represented in all the business sectors you care to name. 1/3 of cooperative insurance, insurance investment is in the hands of mutual and cooperatives. So it's a huge industry, but much of it is very, very small. And it's about changing the world. That's what the pioneers wanted to do, and that's what the movement today continues to do. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline. That's fantastic. That's brought, I think, apart from the question of the women, it's brought a new dimension into what we've been talking about in Capitalism on the Edge, and a very well and necessary one, actually, to bring it all in. Next one, Natasha, do you want to talk about what investors can do in all this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Natasha Landell-Mills, and I head up, as Barbara mentioned earlier, stewardship at Saracen & Partners. Now, Saracen, just very briefly, is a reasonably small asset management company in London. We manage about 14 billion in assets. So in city terms, we're quite small. But something that we do try and do, which we think certainly others will be doing as well, but which we place considerable emphasis on, is actually doing our bit to make capitalism work better, if you like, for society. And we try and do this through 3 sets of activities. First of all, what we do is when we look at companies in which we're trying to invest our clients' assets, we try and take into account some of the longer term impacts that those companies have, the environmental, the social, and also we look very carefully at governance issues to make sure that there's accountability to shareholders at the end of the day. The other thing that we do is that we try and emphasize ownership. So we actively engage with boards in companies in which our clients are invested. And finally, and this is something that's perhaps a little bit different, we place quite a lot of emphasis on policy work. And this is where effectively what we believe is that as managers on behalf of our clients, we're not just interested in outperforming a benchmark which has dominated the industry for many, many years. What we are interested in doing is also raising all boats. So effectively, where we see a problem with the marketplace, or we see a problem with the economy more broadly, actually thinking about what it is that could be fixed, and moreover, how it is we may actually catalyze positive change. And if I may, if I have time, I'll just spend just a few moments talking about some of that policy work, because I think to the question of how to make capitalism better, that's probably the most relevant bit of our work. Now, we're small, as I mentioned, so really we've had to prioritize. And if I think back in terms of just a personal story, I, before Saracen, was working at a big pension scheme, USS, University Superannuation Scheme, which will be funding a lot of the pensions for academics here. And it was at the time of the financial crisis. And at that time, USS, like other institutional investors, were coming under a lot of pressure for what they had failed to do in terms of stopping risky behavior within the banks that they had invested. And it was a legitimate question. You know, you may have heard the term ownerless corporations. Where were the owners and who were holding the banks to account? And the asset managers were quite rightly being asked to step up to the plate and answer this very difficult question. Now, we at that time looked into it in quite a lot of detail, and it's absolutely right to say that asset managers were not thinking long term. They weren't thinking about the risks the executives were taking, and they were thinking about short-term quarterly performance. But one of the other issues that we identified, which is a policy issue, which is a market-wide issue, was that the information that was being provided to investors through the accounts we felt was faulty, that it was misleading. And on the back of that, then, we launched 2 policy initiatives, one on accounting standards, and our aim there was to improve the accounting standards so that investors would have the right information so that they could hold executives to account, and also on audit, and making sure that the audit was objective and independent, and there was proper challenge going on. Now, in our view, neither of those were working properly and needed to be fixed. Now, at that time, there's quite a lot of reform discussions going on within Brussels around how to change the whole audit market. And it was quite interesting to me, perhaps because I was one of the very few women at that time engaging in this discussion, at the lack of challenge within the investment community around this issue. And what we ended up doing was setting up our own coalition of like-minded investors. In the first instance, that was pension schemes, and Saracen & Partners was part of that. And the idea was that we would go to Brussels and call for change and support the initiative that was being undertaken. And we faced a huge amount of lobbying from all sorts of different interests against what we were arguing for. But in the end, the reforms were successful, and I'm not claiming that it was at all just about us, but we did build a coalition of over 2 trillion in euro assets. And what it sort of said to us was that actually, you know, when you do see problems, even if you're small, if you've got the power of the argument, and if you're willing to challenge, and if you have the courage to challenge, it is possible to generate change. And that was just a story that I wanted to share with you in terms of how, in the investment community at least, there are possibilities for individual organizations to actually do things that improve the working of capitalism. The difficulty, in my mind, is far too seldom do people think it's their responsibility to do that. And I think maybe that comes down to accountability, transparency, lots of things. But there are lots of flaws in the system that actually prevent different actors coming forward and pushing for change. And I think that that's something that needs to happen more often. And I would actually go as far as saying that having more diversity, and women is part of that, coming into the city, people who think more holistically about the role of the city and the role of finance, could really help with that challenge and making the system work better.
Thank you. Julie?
So I guess I'm taking the business perspective on this question, and I thought I'd share with you some of my story and how I sort of have changed a number of my views along the way. So I actually started out in strategy and M&A and did a number of acquisitions in the European arena, and was responsible for the integration of those into the wider company. And from a capitalism perspective, obviously all of these acquisitions were assessed, they had a value associated with them, they met the hurdle rate, and then my job was to actually implement that and make it come real. And the way that we approached it was very much around the processes, the systems, the tools, the structures, and they would deliver accretive earnings in the first couple of years, and then we would fold them into their mother businesses and wouldn't be able to uncover whether they delivered the long-term benefits or not, but they delivered in the short term. And I felt that this was something that couldn't really be continued, and I felt quite strongly about this. And we did a number of acquisitions here in the UK that came to an end, and the majority of the acquisitions were continuing in the United States. And so I asked if I could go and do that. It was a great opportunity for me and my family, but also for the organisation. And they'd done 12 acquisitions, none of them had been integrated, and there was a huge opportunity. And so I took a deep breath, asked my boss and said, can I take a different approach? And he said, well, as long as you deliver what I've committed to the shareholders, yes, that's fine. So I took the approach of actually engaging all of the people in our purpose, engaging them in what they thought the plan should be, and taking a much more collaborative approach to then decide what we should do with the systems, the processes, and the tools. We delivered 100 million of capital reduction within the business through efficiencies. We closed 7 call centres, and all of them performed at a higher level than they had done in the 7 years previously. So it demonstrated the power of engaging people. You could still deliver the results, but you could deliver them in a much more human-centred way. From there, I took over as the head of strategy and did some research and found that people spend 6 minutes a year thinking about energy. They spend 13 hours a year on hold. The other piece of surprising information that I found, which we'd never uncovered before, was that 80% of the people that made decisions about whether to purchase our product were women. No man had ever asked that question. So we started to think about restructuring the business, focusing on retention, and how would we deliver products and services that would appeal to our women consumer decision makers to stay with us. I worked with a number of the leading organisations to think about this, and my male counterparts decided that they wanted to continue with M&A. So I decided to make my way back to the UK and was given an opportunity to set up an investment fund investing in energy entrepreneurs that were also creating social change. So I started to view the world as an investor, and how would I create relationships with potential entrepreneurs that hated our company, thought that we were untrustworthy, going to steal their IP and take all of their ideas. It required a different way of thinking. And I used all of my skills that I had learned through my different approach to M&A, that actually it was a very similar human approach that would make the difference. I also recruited a team of people that would look at risks and build relationships. I chose the best people for the job. They happened to be 4 women. Having only ever worked in male teams and been the only female, this was a very strange experience for me. And at this point, the fund had got a lot of profile at the World Economic Forum, and our chief executive had worked closely with us. And he said, Julia, you've done something here. I don't know what it is, but it's something a little bit magical. Do you think you could think about this for the broader organisation? And I sort of had a big gulp and sort of went, what do I know about this? Why are you asking me these questions? And an amazing woman who had been in my life for the last 12 years asked me a question and said, what is it that you're really good at? And this small voice emerged from within me that said, helping 55 to 65-year-old white men see the world in a different way. So I guess that's my purpose. And it's about asking different questions and being curious and exposing the social silences that we all operate within. Whether we're male or female, we know that there are things that are being unsaid, questions that are not being asked. And the more curious that we are, the more I think we can align the needs of society with the needs of business. So I made a choice a year ago to continue with the purpose of Centrica, which I, again, asking the difficult questions, went back into the National Archives and found that in 1812, to the Industrial Revolution, the company was set up to bring heat and light in the significant good of the people. Unfortunately, in 2013, we'd forgot about the significant good of the people and had focused on the significant good of the shareholder. Which had caused Ed Miliband to stand up and decree that should he be elected, he would freeze energy prices, which we knew would be not good for anyone. So we reframed the strategy, we changed our CEO, and Centrica entered a new era, an era of cost-cutting. which I felt that didn't align with my purpose. And although I asked the difficult questions of the 55 to 65-year-old white men, I found that the energy that I got from it was not going to continue to sustain me. So I decided I'd broaden my net and spend my time and energy and effort asking difficult questions to other 55 to 65-year-old white men across the FTSE 100. And that's what I do now. So I'll leave it there.
I love that, Julia. About a long time ago when I was at the King's Fund, we ran a conference on diversity, and somebody said to me, well, who is your diversity, Barbara? And I said, 65-year-old white middle-class men. That was my problem. Anyway, that was a long time ago. Now, that was a really good start in really understanding what you've all done, and to some extent getting into this question about what women do differently. And I'd like to have another round before we let the audience in, which is, actually about that question. Do women do things differently? And where does that help? Or what have you experienced that suggests that's not quite so easy either in the current world that we live in? So again, should we just do it in the same order, because it brings everybody back in? Do you want to start on that one, Pauline?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, within the cooperative movement that I've worked in, women are better represented at senior levels than corporate business. They're not represented well enough, but they're better represented. And I think they bring a different dimension, a much more inclusive dimension. And I've gone and worked with several of the cooperative enterprises and seen how prominent women within the movement are able to achieve much more through a much more inclusive and discursive approach to decision making. I mean, it's the way in which the cooperative movement operates anyway. So for me, my own sense is that it's much easier for women to actually say they were wrong for a start, to actually want to pull in as wide a view before they make decisions. I think they've made a significant difference. I see them as much more inclusive and engaged with people, participative.
But difficult as being a woman?
What you mean? Is it difficult being a woman? Absolutely. I mean, I'm of that generation that grew up believing absolutely that in order to succeed and to move forward, I had to be better than any of the male competitors around me. And I was hoping that by the time my daughter and granddaughters came through that would change. I don't think it is changing or fast enough. So it's, in one sense, I've had quite a charmed life. I've been in the right place at the right time, and lots of things have worked for me. So I can't claim that I've been held back. But certainly, I think my children would say that I'd become a workaholic as a result of that. And it's right. I have never had the right work-life balance because of that, and I think it's something that that women suffer from if they want to go on. So.
And Natasha, you started saying some things that made me think about, are you doing it differently by being a woman? Because you were talking, for example, about the policy issues and bringing together, a coordinated, collaborative approach and things, which sounds like, what actually women traditionally do. But do you want to say something about, do you think you've been doing things differently because you're a woman? And again, what have you hit in terms of challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I always struggle with this question about being a woman and what it brings, because I'm just me, and I define myself partly because I'm a woman, but I'm also, I know, slightly different from other women, for sure, and different from men, and so I always find it hard to kind of isolate that factor, if you like. Having said that, there's no doubt that there's a kind of bit of Venus versus Mars experiences going on all the time. And I suppose, certainly with my policy work, it has struck me that it's actually, in a way, what it is, it's being an outsider, coming in from outside. And indeed, perhaps to touch on a topic that I don't suppose I'd describe as taboo, but I think even where women have had a maternity break, I would say that actually gives them even a broader perspective on the world, on life, on their working life, so that when they come back, they're enriched by that. So I think actually I was coming back from a long maternity stint, and it just meant that I think I approached things in a fresh way. But whether that's because I'm a woman, yes, the maternity break gave me that perspective that men wouldn't have necessarily, though some do take that break. But I do struggle with this idea of whether it's being a woman versus a man. And also, just to add a final comment, one of the things I also struggle with is the fact that we have to have a conversation about how women contribute, because the 50% of the population, of course they do. Yeah. Of course they do. Yeah. Economically, politically, whether it's nurture or nature, we add diversity, we complement men, and to have them not represented at every single level within business, family life, wherever it is, means that you're less resilient and you're less rich for that.
Yeah. Good. Julia.
Well, I was going to start with a comment from my 11-year-old son, who last week, while we were sitting in the bathroom, because that's where the good conversations happen, he just looked at me and went, "You must be really pleased you're a girl." And I went, "Wow, that's really interesting, darling. What makes you say that?" And he said, "Well, you take less risks than I do as a boy. I have been reading in my book. And that means that you're likely to live longer than me, and I'm going to die first." And I went, "Wow, you've done a lot of reading." But I think, in terms of my story, I think the piece that really opened my eyes to the power that women have over capitalism and in the system now is really from three perspectives. And I met the fabulous Jackie Vanderburg of the US Trust, part of the Bank of America, who's done a study on, I have to get my tongue around it properly, but womenomics. And this point around 80% of our consumers decisions being made by women, $15 trillion of global consumerism is women. They are making 80% of the decisions about what to buy. And so business not wising up to this fact is really, really a big issue. And women as executives, when I was an investor, actually, if you look at the Fortune 500 companies that have 3 or more women on the board, they actually provide 84% better return on sales, 60% better return on capital, and 46% better return on equity than their counterparts who have 0 women on the board. So that's a big differentiator. And then in my team, where I ended up having a team of women that was very strange, again, the research backs it up, that women invest 80% back into health, education and nutrition for every pound that they're given, whereas men invest 40%. So, if we're thinking about creating a better society, if we're thinking about meeting the needs of society, there's something in this women economics.